Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Winter 2023 Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. My name is Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education. This is the fifth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with the comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. This series is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints, while highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation. Today, we are fortunate to have an exceptional presenter, Dr. Victor Okafor, Head of Department of Africology and African American Studies at Eastern Michigan University, back again to round out our learning on the Civil Rights Movement, national and Michigan views. We welcome him back for his third installment on this topic and eagerly await today's presentation. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history to our children. This broad effort will help us learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are a part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We're grateful for our presenter today, and we truly thank him for sharing his expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding amongst our educators. I'd also like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team, including our interpreter for today, Candace, for its continued efforts in identifying and selecting key topics and for arranging and organizing this virtual space for us to gather and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you for all of your intentionality, interest, and courage in support of our students, which we refer to as our professional true north, and the preparation for their comprehensive understanding of our country and its history. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. Scott Koenig, Social Studies Consultant here at the MDE, to usher us forward into today's session. Scott?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to share a few housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature, and questions will be addressed toward the end of this event if time permits. If we run out of time, we will follow up Q&A through email. We will provide supporting links using the chat feature for you to access resources that support today's presentation. Today's slideshow will not be available to attendees. However, this presentation will be viewable and can be accessed at a later time on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. Also, if you would like sketches for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat throughout this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. Towards the end of today's presentation, a linked survey will be presented to you once this webinar is closed out. Please provide us with your feedback. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Ms. Candace Barrier. Thanks, Candace, for being with us. Today, we welcome Dr. Victor Okafor. Professor Okafor is head of the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Eastern Michigan University. He is the author of 5 books, has contributed chapters to several anthologies, and published a variety of scholarly articles in such referee journals. Dr. Okafor's writings have also appeared in national magazines and newspapers. Teaching both offline and online, his overall teaching experience embraces courses on or related to the history of Black studies, theories, methods, and methodologies in Black studies, Black politics and public policy, African civilization, multiculturalism, Afrocentricity, and Afrocentrism. As a consultant on multicultural diversity issues, Dr. Okafor serves as an expert court witness on cases related to African cultural questions and issues. Before joining Eastern Michigan University in 1995, Dr. Okafor previously served as the Director of African American Studies and Assistant Professor at North Carolina State University. It is an honor to have you here with us today, Dr. Okafor. Oh, I think we're having a little technical difficulty at this time. And we may have lost our presenter, so we will work to get him back. So thank you for your patience.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Okafor. Great, we have you back. Wonderful.
Yeah, I lost connectivity.
We see that, but we're happy to have you back. We've completed your introduction and welcome, and thank you for working through the technology. And are you ready to present?
Sure.
Okay. Let's go ahead and share your presentation, and we'll be moving forward.
Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm sorry about the technical snafu, but I'm glad that we have been reconnected. This is the third and last edition of my three-part presentation on the civil rights movement in the United States from the 1950s to the 1960s. Today's last segment of my presentation is based on the theme of a transition that occurred during the civil rights movement, from a movement that was focused upon desegregation to one that moved onto a phase for social empowerment. Well, as you will recall from the prior segments of my tripartite presentation, the civil rights movement unfolded as a quest for the elimination of legalized racial segregation, racial discrimination in public affairs. But as it progressed, there came a time when that movement began to evolve into a new phase. What is that new phase? It was a quest for social empowerment. In his seminal work, Introduction to Black Studies, distinguished Professor Maulana Karenga describes that phase as, quote, a self-conscious decision of Africans in the US to initiate a theoretical and practical thrust to redefine and restructure society in Black images and interests, unquote. What this meant was a self-conscious initiative to redefine society in order to culturally, economically, and politically empower a disempowered people of African descent. What were examples of such theoretical and practical initiatives to redefine society in order to socially, politically, economically, and culturally empower people of African descent in the United States? But before I proceed any further, let's get additional clarity about what the concept of Black power ideally stands for, because there seems to be a tendency in some quarters to misrepresent it as the antithesis of white power. There is also an erroneous tendency to suggest that Black power represents an aspiration for Black supremacy as a counter to white supremacy. To be clear, white supremacist ideology is based upon a belief that one's skin color connotes biological superiority or inferiority. That is the binary of white superiority and Black inferiority. That is the basic tenet of white supremacism as an ideological worldview. When I stated in my prior lecture that white supremacist ideology gave rise to the Jim Crow social system of separate but equal, I should have added that the principal reason that Jim Crow sought to create, and for a while did create, a separate social existence, separate public spaces, and even separate cemeteries for whites and blacks in society was simple, quite simple. White supremacism was rooted in an ingrained belief that blacks are biologically inferior. And to that extent, African Americans were a threat to American civilization. This was the motive force for Jim Crow. From a global perspective, worthy of note is that though racial apartheid was known as Jim Crow in the US experience, racial apartheid was not a peculiar US phenomenon. Colonial Africa, both in the settler and non-settler colonies, though more so in the settler colonies, did also witness racial apartheid. Western European colonial settlers in Africa did build their own separate public facilities, separate housing, separate hospitals, separate schools, etc. In the most extreme case of South Africa, colonial apartheid came to an end with the emergence of a Black majority rule in 1994, following a successful, globally coordinated anti-apartheid movement. We know that race is merely a social construct, and that the concept of human biological inferiority or superiority is sheer mythology. To be clear, the dominant contemporary academic thinking on race considers it a mere sociopolitical construct. In fact, the sequencing of the entire human genome in 2002 led to a discovery that human beings are genetically 99.9% alike. From the standpoint of geneticists, there is a high degree of homogeneity in the Homo sapiens species. Generally speaking, the scientific consensus is that the environment, including the ecological and cultural environment, is the main determinant of human conduct and intelligence. So now that we are clear that the ideology of white supremacism was and is premised upon a monumental but now scientifically debunked misconception of human biological superiority or inferiority, at this juncture, let's move on to demonstrate that the concept of Black power was neither meant to serve as the opposite of white power, nor the opposite of white supremacism. What then, as envisioned by the civil rights movement of the 1960s, did the movement visionaries articulate as the meaning of Black power? The Black power movement represented a quest for self-determination, a quest for self-respect, and a quest for self-defense, although a scholar has argued that Black power represents more of a mood than a program of action. As an expression of a mood, argues this scholar, Black power represents, quote, disillusionment and alienation from white America and independence, race pride, and self-respect, or Black consciousness, unquote. Of notable importance was its quest for liberational education, an innovative educational paradigm that would not be grounded in or infected by such contaminants of the dominant education of the day as the doctrines of social Darwinism, kindly paternalism, and biological determinism. It was this dimension of the Black empowerment movement that saw the birth of Black Studies academic programs and departments on US university campuses as from the 1960s, starting with the establishment of the first Black Studies department at San Francisco State University in 1968. As I just noted, the first Department of Black Studies was established in 1968 at San Francisco State College, now San Francisco State University in the state of California. That first bachelor's degree awarding Department of Black Studies at San Francisco State University was established under the leadership of Dr. Nathan Hay. Since then, more than 300 centers, programs, and departments of Black Studies have emerged across US universities. These include 18 universities that offer doctoral degrees in Black Studies. The first PhD in Africology and African American Studies was established in 1988 at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, under the leadership of distinguished Professor Mole Fikete Asante. Take note that across US colleges and universities, Black Studies goes by a variety of names, including Africology, Africology and African American Studies, Black American Studies, African American Studies, Africana Studies, Pan-African Studies, African World Studies, Global African Studies, and African Diaspora Studies. As an extension of liberal arts education, Africology and African American Studies exposes students to a robust and critical study, research, and service on the African world experience, including a particular focus on the life and culture of people of African descent in the Americas. This area of knowledge offers certificates, undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degree programs. The Black Power movement or Black Empowerment movement did have a religious platform. That religious platform included an Islamic dimension. An Islamic dimension most popularly symbolized by the Nation of Islam and captained by Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It portrayed Christianity as a religion of the oppressor. It portrayed Blacks as a chosen people, and it advocated economic uplift, self-reliance, and racial solidarity. There was also a Christian dimension. That Christian dimension was driven by a liberation theology popularized by Albert Cleage. It upheld the Judeo-Christian heritage, but depicted God as Black. It articulated a liberation theology that stressed social struggle, not submission. It had a cultural platform as well. The cultural platform involved cultural redefinition, as symbolized by Kawaida, a theory of social change, inclusive of a cultural festival known as Kwanzaa, with its 7 principles called Nguzo Saba. They are Umoja, unity, Kujichagulia, self-determination, Ujima, collective work and responsibility, Ujama, cooperative economics, Nia, purpose, Kuamba, creativity, and Imani, faith. Kwanzaa is celebrated for 7 days from December 26 to January 1, and each day is devoted to one of its 7 principles. Other symbolic examples of an emergent cultural redefinition include a university campus student organizational name change during the 1960s from what used to be known as the Negro Student Union to the Black Student Union. There was also a renewed pride in African motif, such as the adornment of African attires and adoption of African names. There was a political platform of the Black Power movement. A major outspoken leader of the Black Power phase was Malcolm X, who exemplified a model of Black audaciousness, a need for spiritual and moral regeneration, Black solidarity, Pan-African cooperation, and a vision of civil rights as human rights. As I noted earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. was easily the most prominent leader of the civil rights phase of the movement, based on his doctrine of civil disobedience and nonviolence. Rosa Parks' celebrated refusal to give up her bus seat on November 1, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, was among the early signals of an emergent audaciousness of the period that foreshadowed the movement's later transmutation into a Black social, political, and cultural empowerment quest. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which came out April 16, 1963, was a response to a set of Black clergy and some liberal whites who questioned the appropriateness of his movement. In it, among other things, he enunciated his concept of just and unjust laws. And as you will recall, I did delineate the component parts of that concept in my earlier presentation. Note the MLK-led March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 1963, which attracted an estimated crowd of 250,000. And that March on Washington is famously remembered for his I Have a Dream speech, in which he expressed hope that, and I quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," unquote. As I stated earlier on, King did not die in vain. His movement gave rise to a set of transformative legal reforms, notably the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Equal Housing or Fair Housing Act, and cumulatively, it ushered in both a de jure and a de facto era of racial integration, which remains the dominant racial order of the day. Groundbreaking DNA and genealogical explorations. The modern study of African American life and culture has also extended to groundbreaking DNA and genealogical explorations that have elevated Alex Haley's roots to new technological heights. A prime example is a February 2006 PBS television documentary presentation in which Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. profiles and traces the African and other genetic roots of a set of prominent African Americans through a combination of genealogical, DNA, and historical measurements and analysis. This multidisciplinary method serves as an innovative means by which more African Americans than ever before can trace their ancestries to specific regions and even specific ethnic points of origin in Africa. A point of caution, though, comes from a recent study which indicates that there is a greater genetic diversity among Africans than the inhabitants of the rest of the world put together, given the degree of, quote, historical migrations, and genetic mixing that occurred across the continent, unquote. Therefore, the study, which was published in the journal Science Express, suggests that tracing African-American ancestry in fine detail is a more difficult task than previous studies had assumed. Nonetheless, the increasingly popular DNA tracing of African-American ancestry also brings into sharp focus, more than ever before, a fact that has always been documented by Africologists and other social scientists, namely the multidimensional and multicultural nature of the African-American heritage, a heritage that is predominantly African, but includes a mixture of various degrees of Native American, European, and even Asian genetic lineages. A diverse nation of elastic freedom and democracy. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, particularly the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among other results, effectively removed long-standing legal impediments to the full participation of African Americans in local, state, and national electoral processes. In fact, scholars have pointed out that the 1960s, whose progressive legislative, judicial, and executive reforms knocked down barriers to Black political participation in the South in particular, marked the beginning of full African-American participation in the electoral politics of the nation. But yet, an important point of note is that the old, but now legally dismantled barriers against Black political participation remain one of similar political barriers that other American groups or communities had also faced, but were able to overcome within what has evolved, in my own assessment, as a diverse nation of elastic freedom and democracy. For instance, between 1790 and 1840, white men who did not own property were not allowed to vote, while the right to vote was constitutionally extended to African American men by the 15th Amendment of 1870. For 130 years, between 1790 and 1920, women, Black and white, could not vote in America, while the 19th Amendment of 1920 opened the franchise to American women in general. In practice, for the most part, Black women, along with Black men in the South, were to wait until the 1965 Voting Rights Act to be able to freely vote and register to vote. In my own assessment, within the last 1.5 decades, two major political milestones have substantively symbolized the degree of progress that America has made in diversity and political racial inclusivity, although certain contemporary social challenges linger, such as the prison industrial complex. The two major political milestones are the historic election of Barack Obama, Democrat, Illinois, as the first Black president of the United States in 2008, and his re-election for a second term in 2012. And the other is the election of Kamala Harris, Democrat, California, as the first woman of color vice president of the United States in 2020. My working hypothesis is that Obama's two-term first Black presidency of the United States, 2008 to 2016, and Kamala Harris's emergence as the first woman of color vice president in 2020 are among the major political fruits that this nation, this diverse nation of elastic freedom and democracy, has harvested from the legal and educational reforms engendered by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. In this regard, it's instructive that a preponderance of Barack Obama's presidential electoral support among white voters came from the ranks of those who were described as young and educated, particularly the post-civil rights generation. In the 2008 presidential election, Obama received 54% of the votes of young white voters, ages 18 to 29, in contrast with McCain's 44%. The margin was even wider. In Obama's 2012 presidential re-election, he received 60% of the votes of white voters ages 18 to 29, whereas his Republican challenger, Romney, got only 37% of the votes of that age category of whites who voted in that election. Yet another probable contributory factor might have been the impact on the general psyche of the national political culture of high-profile African-American political and governmental appointments that grew in quantity and regularity in the post-civil rights era. Although more of such high-profile appointments were made by Democratic presidents, among the ones that were truly historic and groundbreaking were the appointment of Thurgood Marshall in 1967 as the first African-American justice of the US Supreme Court by a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, the appointment of General Colin Powell as the first African-American national security advisor in 1988, ironically by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and the appointment of the same General Powell in 1989 as the first African-American chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff by yet another Republican president, George H.W. Bush. This role of chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff not only earned General Powell a place in American history as a national hero for his successful stewardship of the first Iraqi war in 1991, dubbed as Operation Desert Storm, which liberated neighboring Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, but it also catapulted him in public acclaim, so much so that he was widely touted as a possible Republican presidential candidate in the year 2000, a potential candidacy that for a while resulted in the ranking and floating of his name as a front runner in preliminary public opinion surveys. He eventually decided not to run for president. Other epoch-making political appointments include that of the same General Colin Powell as the first African-American United States Secretary of State in 2001 by yet another Republican president, George W. Bush, and the appointment of Condoleezza Rice by George W. Bush as both the first African-American female national security advisor in 2001 and the first Black female US Secretary of State in 2004. It would appear that such high-profile African-American political appointments, starting from the second half of the 20th century, went a long way in influencing and enhancing the American majority population's acceptance of and respect for services of a national higher order rendered by African Americans, services such as judgeships on the highest court in the land, leadership of the entire armed forces of the United States, leadership of the national security establishment, and leadership of the foreign policy machinery of the government, that hitherto tended to be viewed, rightly or wrongly, as preserves of members of the majority culture. A key takeaway. A key takeaway from this three-part presentation is that these aforementioned sociopolitical transformations did not happen by inertia. They came about through organized and protracted human struggles, as we have cataloged and discussed in this presentation. You may recall that earlier on in this closing presentation, I talked about an innovative liberal arts discipline that germinated from the civil rights movement as a liberational addition to the social sciences and humanities. In order to learn about its intellectual and career values, I recommend that you visit the following web file known as Real-Life Examples of What One Can Do with a Degree in Africology and African American Studies. Finally, let me conclude this three-part presentation with a video documentary that captures some of the most poignant reflections of the late Martin Luther King Jr. on the place of African America of his time. The title is MLK Talks New Phase of Civil Rights Struggle, 11 months before his assassination. Thank you very much for your precious time.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Sir, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I'll put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Wherein in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win, and it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains: Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions, People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger? And then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in '64 and even '65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country
I like that as a stopping point for the video, and we've linked, our team has linked the opportunity to see this video on your own, and what an excellent, I think, an excellent resource that might be able to take snippets or even a whole video for classes throughout Michigan. And Dr. Okafor, do you have some thoughts to kind of conclude with for the video for our audience?
Well, I just want to reiterate a point that I made in the closing slide, namely that we must keep in mind that that the progress that racial progress that we made from the civil rights movement didn't come about by itself. It came about through protracted human struggle, and it needs to be maintained. I use the analogy of a car. When you purchase a brand new car, the fact that you purchased it new doesn't mean that it will stay alive for all time. You have to maintain it. You have to oil it. You have to change the parts. If you fail to maintain it, if you fail to give it gasoline, change the oil, sooner or later the car will break down. The same thing happens in the human arena. We have to remain committed. We have to continue to keep our ears and eyes open and to build upon the progress of the past and not rest on our oars. We shouldn't fold our arms and say the job is done. We need to maintain it. We need to continue to maintain it through our educational institutions. There's a saying that those who forget their history are bound to repeat its mistakes. And I believe that a key reason for studying the past is to draw lessons from the past, to help us avoid the mistakes of the past, and to enable us to do better in the present and to chart a better future for ourselves. So we should not relent in our effort to maintain and to build upon what we have achieved.
I think that's a perfect lead-in for, I think we have time for one more question, and maybe your thoughts around the idea of Supreme Court rulings and how that can really empower states and state laws to disenfranchise Black voters. And I think that connects really well to what you're sharing with us. And could you share some more thinking around that?
Well, yeah, we have also seen that in the phases of the past that we examine, that we did see a point in the post-Civil War era, a period called Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. And that period was characterized by significant strides, sociopolitical strides on the part of African Americans. It was a period that saw the enactment of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, along with a set of enabling civil rights acts, okay? But then there came, after Reconstruction eventually collapsed because a new political order came into being, you know, and the Northern Industrial Coalition that made it possible also got fragmented. And so a new political order with a new agenda came into being. And one of the consequences of that was a political realignment. When the war ended, the political party that most African Americans adopted was the Republican Party. Because its visioning, its ideology were in line with African-American political aspirations of that time. So, but then when a new political order emerged, that political order initiated policies that led to the collapse of Reconstruction. And the Supreme Court enabled it. The Supreme Court not only confirmed Jim Crow in its Plessy versus Fugosi ruling of 1896, it went on to nullify all of the civil rights acts that were adopted during the period of Reconstruction, to nullify them. Okay, and so in the 1960s, we had to essentially reinvent the wheel by enacting a new set of civil rights acts. You know, so what that, all of that tells us that there is no permanence in all of these things, and that if we shrink from our commitment, we are likely to relapse. And so if we're going to guard against that human vulnerability to relapsing, we got to maintain our commitment to keeping a society that is open, allowing a system that has proven itself to be elastic. I describe it as a system of elastic freedom and elastic democracy. And I supported it by showing examples of how specific communities that did not have the rights to vote at given time periods eventually acquired those rights. Specific communities that could not participate in politics eventually acquired the right to participate and do participate. But again, all of this happened through human struggle. So we have to stay conscious. We have to remain committed, and the educational systems have a key role to play. They played a role in supporting slavery. Higher education played a role in supporting slavery. Higher education played a role in supporting Jim Crow. And so higher education has a role to play if we're going to maintain the current order. So higher education needs to support it as well, and needs to be progressive in its outlook. And we've seen that there's a ding-dong battle, that there are some conservative elements that from time to time try to pull us backwards. We should not allow them to succeed, knowing that human beings can relapse.
Scott, you're
Well,
muted.
look, I have it. I have it right here, everyone. Thanks for your patience. I was trying to say thank you, Dr. Okafor, for sharing your knowledge with us throughout this three-part series. Your work is so important in helping Michigan's educators teach comprehensive history within their classrooms. We appreciate you. The next three-part webinar series, entitled The Equal Rights Movement, continues on March 15th, 22nd, and 29th of 2023 from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website, which is linked in your chat. Also, the registration is there and available on the website if you haven't already. So bring a friend. For those of you who are attending today, we do invite you to register for future events if you have not already. Thank you all for joining us today. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event. Once I close the Zoom, there should be an email to your accounts. And of course, that you have signed the form to receive your sketch if you are in need of that. Have a great rest of your day. Again, we'll give you a few moments here, about 2 minutes or so, to grab any final links you need from the chat. And we appreciate you. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Have a good day.